welcome everyone, and thanks for joining our Monday Mindshare this week. This is really our second part of a three-part series where we're talking about priming fat oxidation, ketogenesis, and cognitive functions. It's really exciting for SFuels because the history of our company has been really focused around the role of nutrition for athletes as we get into some of these areas of upgrading both fat oxidation and ketogenesis and cognitive function. The application is very wide, and we're going to today be delving into three different lifestyles. One of them is the athlete, but two other lifestyles which has just as much challenge as it relates to meeting endurance challenges head on. And some of our athletes may even be very much one of these other lifestyles also. We'll see if that's the case. But all of these lifestyles, they have one thing in common, that they must endure them and they want to meet them with their very best. And that's what SFuels is certainly about. Now, if you didn't get the chance to check out last week's session, I'll put the link up here in YouTube, and you can check that out. But let's just, for a second, just touch on it. We looked at two real aspects, and that was upgrading fat oxidation and ketogenesis, and then secondly, upgrading cognitive function. And we looked at about 50 studies underneath two meta-analyses that really showed the relationship and the association that caffeine can facilitate the upgrade of fat oxidation, and also through improved ketogenesis on particularly medium chain triglycerides. And then on the right side, we talked a little bit about several studies and their role in increasing the vigor or the assertiveness and really the ability to embrace mental and cognitive challenges with greater ease and calmness. And even we saw in some of those studies talking about how some of these nutritional elements can upgrade the cognitive function so much that we can reduce the perception of the exertion itself. So it's fascinating. And those capabilities of having a dependable, stable energy, being able to embrace and meet, mental challenges head on with calmness and poise, there's just a wide application for those. And that's what we're going to spend some time on today. I think you're going to find it really exciting because it's not something that we've really spent a lot of time on at SFuels to date, but it's something that we're seeing more of our athletes talk about as they use some of these nutritional elements, and also just the macro approach of a more low-carb diet in their lifestyle. The three trending lifestyles that we're going to talk about, and by trending, what I mean is there's just a growth of, if you will, the challenge of enduring these lifestyles. There's a growth in the number of people who can characterize themselves and familiarize themselves with these different lifestyles. Of course, there's competitive endurance sport, and then there is the professional, career-minded, the career professional, if you will, and the workday endurance that's challenging there. I'm going to talk about some numbers in a second. And then the third is the gamer, which, might sound very surprising and very interesting, but I'll give you some numbers in a second, and I think you'll find it fascinating. But endurance sport, of course, this continues to grow. We've been very much founded in the triathlon and the ultra running communities. 4 million triathletes in the US. These are training 10 to 20 hours or more a week. Racing can be, 7.5 to 17 hours. And of course, the ultra marathons can go, through to days, multiple days. So it's no question about the endurance nature of that particular lifestyle that athletes lead. And then secondly is this endurance professional and the career-minded type that they have are wanting to excel in their career. Now, through COVID, what was a sub 8-hour standard average workday in the US has now become 8.5 hours. But that's only half the story. The other side of the coin is that the full day has actually extended as the boundaries have blurred between working from home and working in the office and working virtually. And it's more common now that it's 10 to 12 hours of the full workday that has expanded. Further to that, we find that particularly in the younger generation of these mobile professionals, that on average, they're now flying 7.5 times per year. And of course, some executives are flying dramatically higher than that. But all of this is creating a massive challenge in terms of just enduring that through the day, through the week, and in their career. And lastly is this fascinating lifestyle of the gamer. And it may not be that, and in fact, it isn't, that the gamer is just, if you will, an insular lifestyle itself, but the gamer and the professional are very much one and the same thing, we find. This is not the young teenager. This is, in fact, in the US, 30% of the gamers sit between 18 and 34 years of age. 35 to 54 years of age represents another 26% of the 220 million gamers in the US, and that grew by 30% over this period of COVID. The average age is around 34, and these own a house, they have children. So these are professional people that enjoy the immersion of gameplay. And on average, they're spending 2 to 3 hours in a single session, but the average longest consecutive gameplay of gamers is now between 5 and 5.7 hours at a different relative to the age group you're talking about. So there's some common threads here about these extended endurance challenges that face the athlete, the professional career-minded, and also the gamer. And like I said, many of these lifestyles are intertwined. And our interest at SFuels, of course, is all about going longer in these different lifestyles. For the athlete, that curiosity of the uncharted distance or the duration that they want to see how their body performs and reacts and responds to that challenge. For the career professional, enduring new, expanded, always on world that they live in, and really surviving to execute in this remote virtual world and real world that they live in. And for that gamer, sure, there is the competitiveness of wanting to execute in those extended immersion gameplay environments, but also it's just about, they build and they create new relationships in this gaming environments, in the teams and the groups they form to actually participate in these gaming environments. All of those require the ability to endure, and they're all interested, these different lifestyles are interested to how can I upgrade myself to participate better in that sport environment, in that career environment, in that gaming environment. And that's what we want to spend a little bit of time on today and look at some of the choices that these different lifestyles are using to upgrade themselves to perform better in these different lifestyles. And it's really quite interesting what you find, because the classic choices that these different lifestyles are choosing are seeking to be able to embrace that challenge and rise to meet those challenges and to become more efficient inside of those endurance challenging environments. As I said, for a gamer, that could be 5 to 6 hours. For the mobile professional or the workday professional, 8 to 12 hours of working in the day. The athlete, it could be a 3-hour training session on the weekend. It could be an 8-hour race. Now, one thing I'll say firstly is that not every day, every exercise session, every game requires that we have to upgrade ourselves. And it may be that we're happy not to upgrade ourselves and have a light aerobic day training or a light day at the office or just a easy gameplay environment. But there are times for sure when it is a high intensity training session that I want to nail it in my gym or on my trainer. I have a long session on the weekend. I want to execute it with focus, or obviously a race day. Or in the case of the mobile professional, there are days where I know I've got a flight, I've got to get off the flight and stand up and deliver a critical pitch, or I have to develop and crunch through production of a major presentation or a briefing, etc. And the game player, of course, I want to sometimes come together, form a group, and I want to compete well. And I want to excel, particularly at the end game where it really matters. And in those examples, which may be once or twice a week, we may be looking for how we can upgrade ourselves. We do this already. The athlete does it with equipment. There's choices and life choices that the mobile professional makes. And of course, Obviously, the gamer does it also with equipment. Increasingly, what we're seeing, though, is a role of very targeted surgical nutrition that can facilitate the ability to upgrade both energy systems and also cognitive functions to support. Now, these are classic foods that are chosen. Candy, chocolates, etc., teas, coffees, soft drinks, energy drinks, all of these things are very common choices that we see being made to facilitate, if you will, that upgrading to embrace and to rise to meet these challenges. You'll see with all of these options, and we talked about this last week with Dan, is there's a dramatic variance of sugar and caffeine between these different options. And there's a problem with this tying together of sugar and caffeine. In fact, if you look in nature, you'll rarely see this in a natural food compound of high sugar and caffeine tied together. And a lot of these foods, of course, you'll see it either in the food itself or just the way that we mix foods and drinks together. You'll have this high dose sugar attachment to these choices that can be made. And what I want to do is walk through 3 or 4 cases of where those lifestyles choose these options and what the outcomes are, the classic outcomes are of these choices, because the sugar and the caffeine is tied together and some of the situations and the issues it creates. So on this chart, we talk about 3 different examples. The one on the left is where we have unreliable or untimely effects. The one in the middle is where we have most commonly referred to as brain fog and erratic energy. And the one on the right is a loss of control, whether that be physical or psychological. And we'll talk about each of these 3 and how they play out. So on the left, so if you look at it starting at the bottom and working up, coffee and tea. Well, a tea can be anything between 10 to 15 milligrams of caffeine in a white tea, a green tea 15 to 30 milligrams, a black tea 75 milligrams. Even if you look at coffee and you look at the Robusta bean versus the Arabica bean, there can be twice the amount of caffeine just because of the different bean that is chosen by the coffee shop. The quantity, of course, will obviously make a difference, but a big factor in this is how the brewing occurs of the coffee or the tea, and that can be an instant 63 milligrams. A latte could be 60 to 160, a drip coffee 165 or more milligrams of caffeine. And we've seen these studies done where there's been a team that's gone into a coffee shop, a chain coffee store, ordered the same coffee from a Monday through to a Saturday, looked at the data on the caffeine, and there's been over 2x difference in caffeine. So this can clearly result on this unreliable nature of outcomes when the amount of caffeine can be double in that what you're taking. On the right side here, you see the sports gel. It's still on the left, but just the right example of a sports gel. Well, one of the things that is most consistent in the research on upgrading fat oxidation and ketogenesis is you need about 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body mass. That's quite consistent. It's where it becomes statistically significant, the amount of caffeine to a known outcome of upgraded fat oxidation and ketogenesis. And so if, for example, if you were 75 kilograms in weight or 155 pounds, you would need about 210 milligrams of caffeine, which in a sports environment using these gels probably talks to around 10 of these gels typically. While caffeine takes about 60 minutes before it reaches the peak inside of the blood. So if you were in a half Ironman, 5 hours typically, let's say for a number of athletes, maybe more, maybe less, but let's say it's 5 hours for simplicity's sake, it's going to be 3 hours, just over halfway before you even hit 60% of the minimum dose you need to have a statistically significant impact on your fat oxidation. So it's too little too late, and it's untimely, the effect of it. It's going to come effectively almost at the end of the race, and you really want this in the front half of the race. And now you could just increase the number of sports gels, of course, but when you're looking at 20, 30, 40 grams of carbohydrate in one of these, If you start increasing them, of course, then you run into your gut problems, a very common situation. Okay, the example in the middle. This is most apparent to the workday or the mobile professional, career-minded type, and also to the gamer. And the theory is that if I bring and tie together a high dose of sugar, a high dose of caffeine, and I have that before, I'm more prepared as I go into my game or as I go into my workday, I'm more prepared to excel. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. And if you look at these energy drinks or these mixes of coffee and sugar, very commonly served today, you're probably seeing somewhere between 30 to 35 grams of sugar, 30 to now over 300 milligrams of caffeine in some of these energy drinks, 300 milligrams. Just as context, the general guidance on the ceiling for caffeine is 400 milligrams a day. So these are massive doses, and it's no surprise as you do that insulin skyrockets, and then the sugar crashes, that amount of insulin stays around, and of course it inhibits and switches off the positive benefits, potential benefits of producing ketones and oxidizing fats. All of that is shut off with insulin. That's it's by design, that's what it does. And as a result, you get into these, it's most described as brain fog or just a lack of clarity, cognitive clarity. Commonly, you'll see some tremors and sweats with this, and you have this swinging, erratic energy levels. And of course, this is pretty hard to game and execute well on the game or execute well at work when you can't rely on that energy, you can't think straight. That's a real problem. And then on the right-hand side, this is probably most apparent for the athlete, and again, the mobile, the work professional, the workday professional. For the athlete, this represents in terms of symptoms as a loss of energy and power in a physical context, loss of gut control, and we can also see aggressive surges made in races, and that's obviously followed by a decline after that, where we go into these anaerobic states, we produce lactate, and then we have a subsequent decline after that. In the workday environment, this can be, and we see this, of course, a loss of emotion, a loss of mental control, aggression, and this doesn't bode well, of course, for teaming and group collaboration and effectiveness. Now, this all happens because of unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence begins firstly with some form of stress. It can be real or it can be perceived, whether it's physical in the way of just the nature of a race, and many things, of course, in the work environment. But that stress triggers the demand and high appetite for simple sugars. And it's a very common flow and understanding of how the stress triggers adrenal glands, and these hormonal responses can cause this increased demand for sugar. Now, it's one thing to have one of a gel or a few of these gels in the early part of a race, or a few squares of chocolate at the start of a day. But what we find is that it feeds on itself, and what can become a quite innocuous thing, and taking a few squares of chocolate becomes a whole block of chocolate, or a whole round of these gels, bars, or blocks, etc. These bars and gels can be 20 to 30 grams of sugar, 20 to 40 grams of caffeine. So they're quite dramatic, they're quite large. And what you'll find is they get into this downward spiral. Like I said earlier, 400 grams of caffeine per day is kind of the general guidance ceiling for where you should keep your upper limit to for the consumption of caffeine. Well, we had an athlete come to us through the week after Dan and I had our Monday Mindshare session last week talking about caffeine, and he talked us through his experience on overdosing in exactly this particular scenario that you're seeing here. The intention was to basically be consuming the carbohydrate in these gel blocks that this athlete was taking. They were taking the gel blocks and also an electrolyte that also had caffeine in them. And what we find is that the athlete, after having a horrific race, calculated their consumption of caffeine through the race, and ended up calculating they consumed over 1,300 milligrams of caffeine in the Ironman. And in reflection, no surprise that in the middle of that race, started to experience dramatic nausea. In fact, the athlete said this was way worse than hitting the wall, but nausea, no energy, no power, dry hands, cold, dehydrated, etc. So these are the outcomes of these classic choices that are being used to upgrade the metabolic capability and the cognitive capability of an athlete, of the professional, career-minded, and also of the gamer. And there's a better way to do it. And that's what at SFuels we've been working on, and it's really exciting to be part of this. A week from today, we're going to be launching a whole new approach to upgrade fat oxidation, ketogenic production, and also cognitive function. Our focus will be more on how do we improve the upsides of this and how do we mitigate some of these downside risks. And there's really, in our view, 4 key tenets on developing a product right to do this well. Firstly, in upgrading fat oxidation and ketogenesis, there needs to be a material dosage of some of these nutrients like caffeine, and we need to be able to prime the mitochondria to operate most efficiently to support that oxidation. 2, in the upper right, we want to be able to stack together several nutrients that improve focus and mood while also decreasing our perceived exertion. And at the same time, we don't just want to stimulate all the time. We also want to support and really protect the neurological part of the brain and the neurological system. And in the lower right, a critical aspect in order for this to work efficiently and to avoid those downsides is to untie caffeine and sugar in the product and allow the athlete or the career-minded or the gamer to be able to choose a material amount of caffeine at the time they want it without having to delve into massive doses of sugar and thereby shutting down fat oxidation. We want to optimize fat and carbohydrate oxidation, that we can have both flexibility in our metabolism of being able to oxidize both fat and carbohydrate to deliver a far more stable, sustained energy level through the race, through the training session, through the day at work, or also obviously through the game. And lastly, we really want a predictable, a trusted, measured caffeine dose. We want to know that when we take it, we know what the outcome is going to be. It shouldn't be a surprise to us that it was too little or too much and have an erratic response. Okay, as we said earlier, we're going to be launching our latest product addressed specifically at these lifestyles to support the upgrading of fat oxidation and ketogenesis and cognitive function. Pre-ordering starts next week. I hope you will find that interesting. We're going to talk through all the nutrient profile of this new product next week. We're going to show you how it can be used and how it can be applied to these different lifestyles. And I think you'll find it fascinating. Thanks for joining our Monday Mindshare here at SFuels again. We look forward to catch up with you soon. Thanks for joining us.